Good afternoon. It's my privilege and very special pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Michael O'Flaherty, who is the director of the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency. Before he became the director, he was actually a distinguished human rights law professor and also the chairman of the Northern Irish Human Rights Committee. This is a very exciting CV, and many of the students who work or intend to work in human rights in the future should just look at one step after the other of how you become the person who defines the role and the mission of the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency. The EU is not famous for being a human rights organization, so this is not as easy as it sounds like. And I'm especially glad to receive him here today at an institution which has been not only at the forefront of doing some research on human rights issues in Europe, but also recently in the middle of some conundrums in which the European institutions played a fair share in the last few years. Professor Flaherty, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction, Chair, Your Excellencies, dear friends, students and staff of the university, colleagues. I'm greatly honoured to speak to you on this, the first day of my visit to Hungary. I've been fortunate to visit Budapest on a number of previous occasions. You can't live in Vienna and not come to Budapest often, and I'm really drawn to this city. I'm drawn to it because of its beauty, but also its remarkable history and the warmth of its people, elements of which I've been reminded in every moment, indeed, of today. My topic is why Europe still needs human rights, and I was impelled to take this as a theme because of the worrying patterns of human rights abuse and the extent of challenges to the very system itself that we see in some too many European countries. I will structure my remarks by way of answers to 4 questions. Number 1, what human rights do we have in Europe and how did we get them? 2, has Hungary made a contribution to the human rights infrastructure? 3, what challenges do human rights face in the EU and in Hungary today? And 4, how can we counter those threats and move forward? Over centuries of war and bloodshed, Europe has had many dark chapters. It was arguably after the darkest of them all, when the continent and indeed the world was still reeling from the shock of the Holocaust, that the modern-day story of human rights in Europe began. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaims, as we all know, recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, absolutely and unequivocally. As the Nobel Prize-winning poet Seamus Heaney said, and forgive me for quoting an Irish poet, the Declaration, he's referring to the Universal Declaration, the Declaration has succeeded in creating an international moral consensus. Even if its articles are ignored or flouted, in many cases by governments who have signed up to them, it provides a worldwide amplification system for the still small voice. Here in Europe, we have elaborated the most sophisticated of all the international human rights legal frameworks, a rich interplay of European Union law with Council of Europe and United Nations standards. Article 2 of the EU Treaty stipulates, quote, respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. Not only as the values on which the EU is founded, but values that are shared by all EU member states. The development of the EU's human rights framework culminated in the adoption, as you know, of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which drew directly on the Universal Declaration. The Charter, the EU's very own Bill of Rights, doesn't meddle in countries' internal affairs. It simply lays out the inalienable rights of each person living in the European Union, of all of us. Each individual in the Union has a claim to the rights of the Charter. Wherever these rights are directly applicable, they override the conflicting national laws and Europeans can invoke them before their local courts. As well as the Charter, fundamental rights are enshrined in the general principles of law developed by the European Court of Justice. These principles coexist with the constitutional traditions and the institutions and the cultures of member states. Of course, they also draw on the European Convention on Human Rights, to which all EU member states are party. Respect for the Convention and all it entails is a condition for membership and continued membership of the European Union. Europe's strong normative framework for human rights is supported by an impressive infrastructure of institutions. At the national level, these include national human rights institutions, and I've just come from visiting your Human Rights Commissioner, as well as equality bodies. Regionally, the institutions include the body that I serve, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. And so to my second question, what role has Hungary played in all of this? It was Helmut Kohl, the late German Chancellor, who said, "Hungary was where the first stone was removed from the Berlin Wall." In 1989, thousands of East Germans arrived in Budapest and were able in this way to cross the border into Austria, which would have been impossible over the hard border that had separated the GDR from the Federal Republic. After the transformation, Hungary was at the forefront of the countries that formerly, in the past, lay behind the Iron Curtain. Indeed, in 1999, Hungary and the other candidate countries were observers to the drafting of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. They played an important role in that drafting exercise, and Hungary can take credit for some of the provisions which stand proud in today's Charter. And it was because of the ability of Hungary and other neighbouring countries to conform so quickly to the enormous body of EU law that it joined the EU together with seven other Central Eastern European countries in 2004. And the stories of Hungarian achievement in the area of human rights law don't stop in 2004. There are elements of law, at least of law, in this country today which remain very impressive and international good practice, such as the fundamental law, which captures at the domestic level important provisions of the European Charter, and your globally groundbreaking law on stateless persons. But moving on, however, we have to acknowledge that time has not stood still. And so I need to answer my third question. What are the challenges facing human rights now? Firstly, we must recognize that the challenges to human rights in Europe are grave and they are growing. We see this every day in the situation of refugees and other migrants. We see journalists whose freedom is curtailed to an unacceptable extent, either by the state or by monopolistic tendencies in the private sector. Our data privacy is at risk from surveillance by the state, which in turn is seeking to assuage public fears about terrorism. We see the threat of rising intolerance both on and offline. I'm also concerned about the levels of social inequality in our societies and the incidence of poverty, including child poverty. Here in Hungary, it is worth recalling how inequalities so badly hit minority groups such as the Roma. Beyond unacceptable patterns of failure to deliver effective human rights protection, we also have to acknowledge an underlying malaise. This is the increasing willingness of some who hold power to repudiate the very human rights values and systems themselves, or at best, to see the human rights systems as somehow voluntary or some kind of a buffet from which you can pick and choose what you find useful. This phenomenon is relatively new, and it is a matter of extreme concern, given the ways in which it can corrode, can weaken the system. So let me turn then to some of the most pressing contemporary thematic concerns in some detail. Firstly, migration. I begin with migration because it is a topic set to remain at the very pinnacle of the EU agenda and is and will remain a major preoccupation of my agency. I'm just back from a visit to the so-called reception hotspots in Greece and Italy, and I have seen how, despite genuine goodwill and real effort, so much remains to be done to ensure decent conditions and to guarantee the safety of men, women, and children. I'm particularly concerned about the detention of migrants, particularly of migrant children, an act which must always remain a response of last resort. It'll be impossible to get the Dublin system to work effectively as long as systematic detention is taking place, as well as alleged pushbacks occur in some member states. As I reflect on pushbacks, refoulement, detention, words are brought to mind of Saint Stephen, the founder of the Hungarian nation state, who said, "A country that has only one language and only one tradition is weak and failing. I therefore urge you to welcome the foreigner kindly and hold him in honor, so that he prefers to stay with you rather than elsewhere." Of course, the migrant's journey does not end when he or she reaches the EU, and neither do the challenges, as the Fundamental Rights Agency describes in our monthly public reporting on the topic. Those allowed to stay, and the EU has extremely strict rules about who can and who cannot remain here, those who are allowed to stay must be assisted. Only when they have accommodation, have the opportunity to learn the language and send their children to school, and their qualifications have been recognized, only then can they begin to contribute with their own skills and experience to enrich our societies. However, a major impediment to the process of integrating migrants is the continued lack of a genuine European solidarity that is so much needed to ease the unacceptable burden on Greece, on Italy, and on other affected EU countries. A proverb that I'm told is Hungarian seems relevant here. It goes, "As you greet others, so will you be greeted yourself." This proverb reminds us also of the ethical action that is demanded of each of us. After all, and as history has shown, we can never be sure what tomorrow will bring. Indeed, here in Hungary, it's not so long ago that your compatriots were forced to seek refuge from the events unfolding here in this country. Our histories, our shared histories, our common histories, remind us that solidarity is not just a value that relates to circumstances now, but stretches back to the past and moves forward to the future. This is also what makes solidarity so powerful as a core value for Europe, Europe with its checkered history and its diverse present. Let me turn to the rule of law. The rule of law is vital to a functioning democracy. This is recognized clearly in your own Hungarian constitution, where Article B says, "Hungary shall be an independent, democratic state governed by the rule of law." Among the four most important aspects of the rule of law are an independent judiciary, a free and thriving media, integrity of public officials, the principle of legal clarity. All of these are critical to the overall human rights framework. A breakdown in the rule of law would be devastating for a state. It could lead to a collapse of public trust. It would lead to a collapse of public trust in the fairness and the quality of a country's political and legal system. The impact for human rights is obvious. Less evident, perhaps, are the ancillary concerns, such as financial repercussions. Here I have in mind the need for investors to have trust in a country, in order for them to put faith and their money in it. In other words, a level playing field and a strong judicial system foster the investment that the economy needs. Respect for the rule of law can therefore be regarded as a key element of sustainable economic growth. All of the dimensions of the rule of law constitute essential constraints on the abuse of power, and in this way they serve as guarantors for our democracies. And it's important for me to stress this afternoon that each member state in the European Union can be proud to be a democracy. In this regard, all of us Europeans can be proud of the achievements of those countries that struggled against and surmounted totalitarian rule in the not-so-distant past. 28 years ago is not long ago at all. Let me turn now to the issue of civil society. Civil society plays an essential role for a vibrant, free society that respects human rights. Furthermore, it is a straightforward matter of international human rights law that the state must foster a space within which civil society can thrive. However, for a number of years now, civil society organisations across the EU and beyond have reported a diversity of pressures. Problems range from direct physical attacks on persons and property, reduction in access to financial resources, through to burdensome regulation and far fewer opportunities to access decision makers in a meaningful way. This is an issue that my agency is following closely, and it will be the subject of a major report of ours later this year that will assess the situation and propose actions relevant to all EU member states. And I can certainly assure you that the particular situation in Hungary is being taken close account of and will be adequately addressed in our report, our recommendations, and our other actions. And while speaking of civil society, I would like to take this opportunity also to express appreciation to a very good friend of the Fundamental Rights Agency, an increasingly close partner, the EEA and Norway grants. And we would wish to express appreciation for the vital role that they have played and continue to play in nurturing and supporting strong, free civil societies across their beneficiary countries, including this one. Academic freedom. The academy is a key component of civil society. It is imperative that the EU remains a space in which researchers, scientific knowledge, and technology circulate freely. Article 13 of the Fundamental Rights Charter, which was approved by the leaders of all EU member states in 2007, reflects national and international standards when it explicitly states that the arts and scientific research must be free from constraint. Dear friends, you may be surprised that so far I have made little direct mention of the current circumstances in Hungary. But rather than reiterating the authoritative commentary and recommendations of the European Commission, of the Council of Europe, of the Council of Europe Human Rights Commissioner, of the Council of Europe Venice Commission, rather than do that, I have sought to examine the situation in a broader context. And as I hope I have made clear, there is no EU country in which human rights are not at risk in some fashion, in some way. At the same time, of course, there are concerns here in Hungary in light of the applicable European and international treaty-based human rights commitments. And during this visit, I seek to discuss these with the government in an open and a frank manner. In so doing, I offer the advice of the Fundamental Rights Agency in addressing those areas and issues where we have the appropriate expertise and mandate. By way of conclusion, I would like to suggest a number of actions that we could all undertake in order to address the human rights deficiencies across our European societies. First, fight the fear. The fear of change, of poverty, of safety for one's family and loved ones is tangible in Europe today. This fear is not only fueling support for populists in the European Union and beyond, but it is all too often leading to hatred, to hate campaigns, whether against a single person or an idea. They are unjust, they are undemocratic, and they are unacceptable, these campaigns. István Bibo, the great Hungarian political philosopher and lawyer, who played such an important role in the 1956 revolution and was sentenced to life imprisonment by the communist authorities, said, and I quote, "To be a true democrat, it means above all that you do not fear. It means not to be afraid of other opinions, other languages, other religions, depravity, and all those imaginary perils which are becoming a real danger since we are afraid of them." To believe in open societies does not mean to be unpatriotic or to turn one's back on one's country. Neither does it entail becoming a member of some ruthless internationalist elite. We can be patriotic, tolerant, and assist those in need. We need not be afraid. Second, invoke the law. It is important, it is vital that we return again and again to the point that human rights are not about being nice to people, or for that matter, about charity or philanthropy. States have made legally binding commitments that they must stand up for and adhere to. It's as simple as that. The recent rulings of the European Court of Justice against Hungary and Slovakia on relocation quotas of migrants is a very good case in point. It goes without saying that this important decision needs to be implemented. Third, use solid data. We need to listen more and better to rights holders, both the general population and groups most at risk of abuse. This is, by the way, part of the core work of the Fundamental Rights Agency. For instance, just 2 weeks ago, we published the findings of a major survey of Muslim communities in 15 EU member states. Many people were surprised to learn from our data, that the overwhelming majority of Muslims in the European Union have a strong sense of belonging to their countries of residence, notwithstanding the widespread prevalence of discrimination. And notably, and this is fascinating, their levels of trust in the institutions of the state are stronger than those of the general population. And before moving off the issue of listening to rights holders, let me again return to civil society. Very often the voice of the rights holder needs to be mediated, and the most important mediator for that voice, that imperative contribution to the discourse, is civil society. Fourth, we have to rehabilitate the concept of human rights. We have to repudiate the increasingly vocal claim that human rights is a failed project, or best, that it is irrelevant to the great issues of the day. We need to challenge the growing sense also that rights are not about us, but instead are for the others who are different or less deserving. That is why it is more important than ever for us to demonstrate to our brothers and sisters that human rights are about all of us, about us. This we can do, for example, by framing the great issues of the day, such as unemployment, access to health care, and the conditions of older people, as human rights issues. We also need systematically to make the business case, showing how human rights respectful laws and policies are more sustainable. They make for better societies. Fifth and finally, have hope. I remain stubbornly optimistic. Despite the worrying trends I've outlined, I detect an impressive and growing pushback. A return to the principles and values laid down in the EU's founding treaties, a greater balance in public debate, and a resilience of the young in demanding integrity and respect for human rights. Take, for example, the tens of thousands of people here in Budapest who have demonstrated on key issues in recent months. We certainly have a long way to go, there's no doubt about that. But we must proceed with an optimism founded on the spirit of the achievement of our peoples through the centuries. We must have the courage of our convictions, the courage to speak out against human rights violations, and the courage to act. With this courage, with energy, and with goodwill, we will ensure that human rights protection does not become what it risks becoming, a hollow shell, but instead remains at the beating heart of our societies. Let me leave the last word to another Nobel Prize winner, this time the Hungarian writer Imre Kertész, I forgive the pronunciations, who said, and I quote, "At the bottom of all great realizations, even if they are born of unsurpassed tragedies, there lies the greatest European value of all, the longing for liberty, which suffuses our lives with something more, a richness, making us aware of the positive fact of our existence and the responsibility that we all bear for it." I thank you for your attention.